Probe honk.
Hey, hey,
Honk, I do say honk.
how you doing?
I'm living the dream. Nice D&D hat.
Thank you.
As shitty as Wizards of the Coast, excuse me, we're recorded. As shitty as Wizards of the Coast may slightly be at this exact moment. You've heard the drama, yeah?
I have.
Yeah. Yep. I don't think I've been to one of these TAC meetings in a long time.
It's great. It'll change your life.
Yeah, I
The
love,
greatest 60 minutes in open source.
I know. There's nothing that gets me more excited than bureaucracy in open source. Yep.
Aw, but we're good bureaucracy.
I know. So
all the bureaucrats say that.
I know. So this is the TAC meeting, but do all of the TAC members usually attend this meeting, or is the TAC and another group that is?
Generally, we have almost everybody. Occasionally, we'll have one or two not around. Generally, around major conferences.
Yeah.
Hi, guys. Everyone's here. Hello.
Ava, I heard that you have been are going to be the keynote speaker at Shmoo.
That is correct.
Woo.
Yeah.
Do you, by chance, happen to have a spare Shmoo ticket kicking around in your pocket?
How very bold of you. I do not.
Okay.
We're so sorry.
No, we're looking for one for Yesenia. So
yeah. A dear friend had gifted me a DEF CON ticket many years ago, so I returned the favor.
That's very fair. If you have anybody in your sphere, or anybody else in this call has anybody in their sphere that happens to have a Shmoo ticket, or is willing to poke their shake their tree of social circles to see if they can shake out a ShmooCon ticket, the Alpha Omega team would be greatly appreciative.
We'll give it another minute for folks to join. I will put a link to the meeting minutes in the chat for folks. And if you haven't yet, please put your name in the attendance list. All right, looking at the list of folks on the call, we may have to do a reordering or call an audible on the agenda here. So I don't see John Meadows on unless he's under a different name. So Crow, but if you're okay, I may call on you sooner than later for your two topics. If you're good with that, thank you. We'll give it 30 more seconds and then get going here. Just looking at TAC members present, myself, Krobe, Ava, Josh, Luke, which means we're missing Abhishek, and
Dan's in the waiting room.
Okay. All right, we will go ahead and get started. I still don't see John Meadows on the list, so we will punt the end user working group topic to later in the agenda. Crow, I think you had mentioned a couple of these briefly before we went on holiday as being FYIs, but there are two updates, or I guess two proposals rather, that you would wanted to bring to this group. I will hand it over to you.
Right. We spoke a month ago. I requested the tax feedback on these two proposals. The first proposal is funding to rehome the current private and public OSS security mailing lists. They have been in existence in some form or other since 2008. And that is how most of traditional open source coordinates and informs around vulnerability. The list currently exists on some servers in the Russian Federation, which brings some problems in the current geopolitical environment for many reasons. And I've been working with a fellow with the handle Solar Designer on a proposal to move for the foundation to fund moving and some ongoing funding for operations on moving the lists either to the EU or perhaps Canada, a little bit more neutral territory where he'd have less connectivity and political issues in continuing on the work of those lists. So he proposed two different scenarios, essentially. One where the foundation potentially would fund new equipment and connectivity, and then where he would, Solar would continue on with some administrative functions. And then if we were interested in expanding the services and capabilities of the list, he included some additional requests for funding for those efforts if the foundation desires to increase the utilization and services the lists offer. So that is issue 132. Any questions or comments?
I'll just say I'm very supportive here.
Sorry, Dan.
I just said I'm very supportive here.
Very supportive. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
I would turn a question to the OpenSSF staff on the call and say, do you have any thoughts or concerns or capacity questions around running that mailing list? Was that the proposal, Crow, to move it over here, or help run infrastructure to move it somewhere else?
I know Bressers has some direct experience. I don't know how many other folks have working with Solar in the past. He is an open source personality.
Dude,
and
legend, not a personality.
He's a legend, but like most legends, has some personality quirks. And he is first and foremost extremely paranoid. I tried on numerous occasions to persuade him to take advantage of some delightful, high capacity, high resiliency cloud infrastructure for the equipment. And he had flatly refused numerous times. He is old school. He wants some iron in a data center somewhere that has locked doors. So he, at this point, is not interested in direct assistance in operating the list. That's part of the fee that he would continue on to help maintain the lists. But as we continue to earn his trust, we potentially could be able to help provide people to assist with the maintenance in the list or evangelism of the list. So it's just basically, at this point, he wants money for equipment and connectivity, and then a maintenance fee so he can continue to maintain the list at this point. But that potentially could change in the future.
I guess my only question under those sorts of constraints would be, should this be put out as an opportunity for the foundation to fund, or an opportunity for a particular foundation member? I mean, we have many members that actually do create hardware as part of their business. So as a worthy donation to something versus it being kind of something that has to come out of run rate budget would be a question I guess I would have in terms of like we have to necessarily fund it per se. Just put out a call for, hey, that funding it directly is an option, but if there's somebody that feels particularly passionate about helping Solar Designer out.
Yeah, I don't think he would object to that. And if the TAC is interested and wants to continue talking about this, I would be glad to broker a meeting where we can actually talk with him and he can speak for himself. But essentially, he just wants some big iron. He is very distrusting of the cloud.
Yeah, understood.
Yeah, I think that would be a fine way to defer the costs, is to get members to potentially donate said equipment.
Okay. I see two other hands and I want to be cognizant of time on this as well. So Brian, go ahead.
Sure. From an OpenSSF staff point of view, there's not really any burden here because what I see being proposed is simply an ask for funding that would go to somebody else to do the hard work. So there's not, as I see it, kind of an impact on us, except for tracking the spend or kind of just like the administrative glue, but not to run the servers ourselves or run any operations or anything like that. So supportive of that. The second thing I wanted to say is I feel like in the conversations we've evolved around process and funding and that in the last few quarters, the role here for the TAC is to kind of either give a thumbs up or a thumbs down from both a technical vetting point of view and really is this the right thing for the community, for the industry, from your point of view, and then our job. Once you've come to that, our job at my job as like OpenSSF GM and our job as staff, as well as folks like Bob, and then on the governing board is decide, do we want to try to source this from some bucket of funds we have from an approved budget somewhere, or something one-off and in addition, or do we go out to individual members and get this funded? And there's still some value in having this funded, even if it's by 2 or 3 of our members, then still coming through OpenSSF and being managed that way. Of course, if there was one company out there who wanted to just spring up and support this and be a sponsor of it, we wouldn't stand in the way of that either. But we'll figure out how to get it funded is my point. I think the ask for the TAC is this technically makes sense? Does it make sense from serving the needs of the open source community and all that?
And I'll note before we move to Justin, he was very receptive to the idea of, if like our next proposal is the open source security cert, he was very receptive to that, his lists becoming a key component to the outreach and communication post coordination. So he's very open to expanding the use and the reach of the lists. And comments welcome.
Justin?
I mean, it seems an incredibly inefficient usage of funds to stand up an on-prem email server because we have one maintainer that's paranoid. And I know that's a bit of a spicy take, but like, I feel like there are more efficient ways for us to use our money to have higher impact than spending on an incredibly expensive email server. When there are things that this organization could do that no other organization is well placed to do.
Josh?
Justin is right, but I think the thing I would try to keep in mind is an enormous amount of like Linux kernel and kind of the low level distro stuff is coordinated by this. And it's all going through Russia right now. And that's like a terrifying prospect. And so you're 100% correct, but the reality is also very dire, I think, at the moment. So I think that's something we need to think about as well. I mean, I don't think perfect world. Yeah, we should totally be hosting this somewhere reasonable, but we got what we got, unfortunately.
And he has problems with connectivity. The internet pipe to the facility is not always super stable. There are problems with external people connecting because of block lists, for example. So there's a lot of connectivity challenges for people trying to get to the list because of where the location.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would +1 essentially Josh's comment, which is and Justin's kind of commentary as well. Like, let's stop the bleeding in a sense. But looking forward, I think again, is it within the charter of our our organization more broadly, or would a member organization be happy to stand up and help to do this? I think is maybe an interesting further discussion. But I think to Brian's point around the TAC does not make funding decisions. The TAC simply just makes recommendations around things are worthy or not. And so I'd like to keep the discussion focused around on that point. Abhishek?
So I wanted to discuss Justin's point a little bit more, because I feel slightly the same way, which is what's a long-term solution to this problem? Like, other than moving the infrastructure, if he does, let's say, some additional work to port these vulnerabilities to, let's say, a better schema like OSV schema, or puts them in GitHub security advisories, that might be a long-term win, which we should see as part of this journey. Like, if it's just, let's say, moving infrastructure from one place to another, I don't see it as a good win. So even if we pay a little more money but have it as a long-term solution, that might be better. So I would be more in favor of that, rather than just moving infrastructure from one location to other.
And I would be glad to broker a actual IRL conversation between him and any interested folks that wanted to discuss it.
See several hands. I'm not quite sure who was first. So Ava, you show up first on my screen, so I'll let you go.
Okay. Chris, can you, I want to make sure I'm understanding something correctly. Is the list in question here, since I'm not a participant in it, but I've heard of it for a long time, my understanding is this is where folks are discussing not yet announced vulnerabilities. Is that correct?
There are several lists.
Okay.
First off is the public OSS security list, which is a feed of as things go public. There is the secret and private distros list. That is where actual coordination happens all the time.
Thank you for confirming that. That matches what I've done in other communities, going back to OpenStack days, where we had similar private and then public lists. I can quite well understand solo designers' concerns about putting this on a cloud, using donated infrastructure, using a hardware that someone else bought and then gave to him. All of those would be red flags if I were running such a list myself. There are challenges, I'm going to repeat what I wrote in chat, with running truly zero knowledge based email in certain places. I think this is an important thing, an important part of the open source ecosystem. I think it's, from a foundation perspective, it doesn't sound like it will require much of our pool to do this. Right? It doesn't require significant staff time. It does require us talking about it, being aware of it. It might be a thing that we can say, hey, look, we are helping open source as a whole in this way. And really all we're doing is connecting the right resources to a person who needs it right now. And it's a pretty good media op if we want to turn this into a media op, and the TAC isn't making decisions based on media awareness, but maybe not media, but at least in open source circles. We did a good thing, look at that. Technically though, or long-term, I don't see how it really fits in our current bag of what are the main pillars we're working on that we want to do long-term. So I'm mixed on this one.
All right, David, and then we need to move on to other topics. So go ahead.
Well, just really quickly, I agree that I think that this needs to be sort of taken offline, that they're not going to solve it here. I mean, all due respect to the tech here, though I think that it would be good to try to find, as I said, a long-term solution to differentiate between what you want to actually technically solve first, and whether, again, not necessarily the tech here itself making the decision, but Chris and others to decide that, can you have a conversation with this person? Is there a process here to evolve, again, with more confidence, that once he has, for example, this hardware, that then you can evolve to other solutions in the long term? And that's sort of what I would hope that the TAC would work on is actually sort of advising, not just solving this problem, which I think is useful, but also planning out sort of psychologically how you're going to interact with this person, this community, or recommending some people to be the point of contact with this, to have a longer term strategy to solve it, and not just a matter of what you want to accomplish in this specific request.
Okay, appreciate the feedback, David. So I guess, Crow, based on the conversation, would you like us to kind of formally vote or call for a judgment of consensus, or do you think we need to have more discussion offline before?
I would ask a point of order first off. Since I'm the dude that helped write this, I probably should recuse myself from a vote. Would that be correct?
No.
No?
Because you're not an interested party in this. I'm sorry, I don't mean to barge in, but
Okay.
my take would be, you've worked to create the proposal in good faith because you thought it was the right thing to do, but you don't stand to personally benefit or Intel to benefit from this. So I don't see a reason.
Yeah, I'm not on the list, so
not to-
I don't want to be on the list.
Even if you were on the
Knowledge-
list,
knowledge-
even that would be a conflict, in my opinion.
Yeah. Knowledge brings responsibility. I want none. So yeah, I would love for the TAC to make a recommendation up to the GB, and I would be glad to bring interested parties together to talk about the actual implementation. But if we could express, in spirit, we like the idea and we would work towards, this targeted move, and then long-term something else, I think that would be acceptable.
So here's what I would ask for, Crow. I know you've written up the issue on GitHub. I guess if you wouldn't mind taking the stab at that proposed note that we would send to the governing board, effectively framing the conversation. This is what the essential recommendation is. I think we can have a.
Sounds like more responsibility, man. You're harshing my mellow. Yes, I'll write up a.
But I think sending that out, let's time box that, call for edits, and then we can deal with it offline. I think from a consensus perspective, we can do that and then push forward there. If you're up for that, I think that would be that makes sense to me as the next step.
I will write up a draft proposal email and send it to the TAC for comments.
Perfect, thank you. All right, and then you had the cert.
Actually, Jonathan showed up.
I did know that.
You want to jump to him? He's much more important than I am.
I don't know about that. Sorry about the delay. Had a few technical challenges this morning or Saturday.
No worries. All right, John, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. So we come to the TAC representing the end user group, and we have two proposals we'd like to put forward, two connected proposals. One proposal is on a taxonomy for supply chain attacks. And the second proposal is an architecture on how to address those attacks. I wonder if, Andrew, you could perhaps share the taxonomy document. Is that appropriate? Or I can talk through it at the same time? Sure. As you're trying to do that, I'll talk through it anyway. So really, one of the things that we are trying to do through the end user group is trying to identify how to mitigate supply chain attacks and how to discuss them. And what's clear is, actually it's the other document, Andrew, if that's possible. And one of the problems we have is we're calling things different things, and it's difficult to figure out which attack to mitigate with what. So what we're trying to do is pull together a common taxonomy, and that's one of the things that we started to discuss as a group. And what we found was that Henrik and Pierre Giorgio, who joined the call here, have actually created a paper describing the taxonomy of supply chain attacks. We reviewed this, and it looked to be a really useful construct to help us explain what supply chain attacks were in the wild and how we could actually mitigate them. So our proposal is that we'd adopt the taxonomy, bring it into the end user group, and help to maintain and grow it, and perhaps distribute that through the OSSF to identify this is how we can talk about specific supply chain attacks. Now, in addition to that taxonomy, they also have the paper that is referenced there, but a online explorer tool, which is quite a useful visualization of that taxonomy that I think people may have seen before. And there's potential to bring that into the group. The original developers, Henrik, and his previous company are certainly supportive of contributing that back over to us. So that that could be something that we'd look to pick up. But the main point here is to adopt that taxonomy, and then we'd be able to use that within our documentation, certainly within the end user group throughout the OSSF, I think, to make sure that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about these different attacks. Now, I'll pause briefly there before I highlight the usage of that as we move into the architecture, but are there any questions on that? It might be easy to explain how we're going to use that if we talk about the architecture, but I did want to give people time to comment on that. People may have seen this already. Okay, so let's jump to the second document. I think it may come into a bit more of an easier picture to understand. So that's the taxonomy we suggest we'd adopt. But if you go to the second document, Andrew, yep, there we go. Now, one of the reasons for looking at this taxonomy is it's challenging for us in the end user group to, and I think in multiple working groups, to figure out how to develop an end-to-end supply chain solution, because we've not really got an understanding of how the different components fit together, right? I think we've got lots of different working groups doing some great work, but for an end user to actually solve some of these problems, we don't understand how to plug these things together. It's difficult to talk about it. And as I said earlier, it's not easy to understand even what threats are coming against our architecture and what we're trying to mitigate. So if you go down a little bit further, Andrew, to that picture, what we're suggesting is we stand up an initiative to pull together a program to bring this all together, right? If you go a little bit further, Andrew, to the little diagram. We'll get there in a minute, but there's a diagram basically where we're suggesting we're going to put together a couple of architectures in the group to show this is what an end user looks like, whether it's a small company, a regulated company, a hospital, for example. And then we're going to apply that taxonomy we just showed to figure out, look, these are the attacks that are in the threat landscape at the moment. These are the attacks where end users are suffering. And this is where they hit that particular architecture. And then from that, we can identify, right, so given that, we can figure out where within the OSSF, the different projects that we have, the different standards that we have mapped to prevent and mitigate those attacks and threats. So we can show where SALSA fits within that particular architecture. We can show where the S2SF fits. And it'll just help us align for an end user perspective, I think as a wider group, what we're actually trying to do, how we're trying to mitigate those threats and which projects are going to be useful and where. And it sort of ties the thing together. Andrew, it's really quite, I think, instructive if we can get to that picture, just literally 10 lines down, if you can page down in that. No, we can't quite get there. Oh, there we go. There we go. So let me explain that again, just so you can see that picture. So the suggestion is we'd create a couple of different architectures for end users. We'd take that taxonomy and threat model these architectures so we understand where these threats are. And then we'd be able to see, right, these are the threats coming in, and this is how SALSA would mitigate those threats. This is how SSDF mitigates those threats. This is where this particular work group is trying to provide some work to help secure that supply chain. And that really allows us to link back the value that we're providing from OSSF to the actual threat we're trying to mitigate, sort of connect it all back together again. Does that make sense? Any comments or feedback on that? Deathly silence. We'd walk through it with a couple of you on the TAC on what the taxonomy means and where the different architectures link into it. We had some pretty positive feedback on the taxonomy when we discussed that earlier. And I think from the end user group and the feedback from that group, it certainly helps us understand what we're trying to do at the OSSF and how to move forward, really. So that's really why we're proposing it. Now, the proposal is we take it on at the end user group level, but happy to discuss other approaches. Eva, got your hand raised.
I think Bob was first.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's fine.
I like the graphic that you eventually scrolled down to. It's got like 5 or 6 buckets and a nice arrangement. I want to ask about the much more detailed lexical diagram in the paper that you've linked. What's the relationship there, since you didn't get to it in your description yet?
Not sure which picture you're referring to, Eva.
The ArcSiv PDF. See, from your Google Doc, it is the taxonomy paper, the second link, the first one in the appendix there.
I'm just not sure which picture you're referring to. Is the one where it shows the taxonomy spreading out and you see?
It's the tree of lexical definitions.
So that, I mean, Henrik is on the call. He can explain it in more detail perhaps than I, but effectively that's the association between the different taxonomy and attacks. So you'd have the aggregation at the top or on the left-hand side, and the specialization as you go through to the right. So there may be compromising package being one of those components, and further on to the right, you'll have each of the individual specialized attacks to give you more detail. And that visualization is quite useful. It allows people to browse those particular attacks and understand where that choke point is. So you'll find actually, if you look at prevalence data, so I've actually done some research looking at the last 7 years of attacks and mapping that to the taxonomy. And you'll see where it actually fits in that taxonomy and where the choke point is further to the left. So what you can identify is actually if you mitigate a control point further on the left of that taxonomy, you'll actually mitigate a whole host of those subsequent attacks. And now if you map that to your architecture, you can see, hang on, all the things we're talking about, if we just hit this piece and mitigate that problem, we actually prevent a host of those attacks. And that's really the approach. Does that answer your question, Eva?
It does. And my follow-on is to, in your proposal to the TAC, sort of looking at the structures and terminology lexicon you're proposing. This paper is wonderful and new to me. I'm curious how much mapping of that complex lexicon onto existing OpenSSF work and work streams and products has been done, or are you proposing to do, if that would require or suggest renaming things we've already named?
Well, that's a great point, Eva. And I think certainly going forward, as we discuss it within the end user group, it's useful to have that commonality and mapping it to that taxonomy. I think there's a separate adjunct point as whether we want to go through the OSSF and align that. I think that's a great question for debate. We've got to start somewhere, I'd suggest. Bob,
my question was exactly that last one that Eva raised, which was, how much of that gap analysis on the taxonomy side have we already done versus need to do? But I think you answered it. Luke.
Yeah, I just wanted to see what do you think would be the end deliverable here? Would this be like Fresca, like a tool set, or a sort of a website, or a white paper, a PDF, or what's the kind of deliverable?
Yeah, great point. So on the taxonomy, the deliverable is effectively what already exists. It's the paper, the website, which has the taxonomy laid out. You go to the sap.github itself, that effectively is the deliverable. On the outcome and deliverable for the architecture itself, there's a number of deliverables. Several different architectures to give examples of end users, threat model for each one of those, and a picture in collaboration with other groups, by the way, because I think there are clear intersections with other groups here, particularly the diagramming group. A picture effectively is, that's the architecture, and this is the overlay where Salsa fits, or those other different working groups fits, so that from an end user perspective, they turn up, they say, well, where do I go? What is the threat? And how do I mitigate it? They can see from that documentation where to actually connect it back up to. I think those are the visible deliveries, Luke.
Yeah.
I think the value we get out of it is the ability to talk about the value from these different projects and capabilities. We can now state point blank, Salsa mitigates these threats, and that's how we can talk about them. That's why we need to invest or move things around.
Yeah, let me raise my hand.
Does that answer your question, Luke?
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I'm going to jump in. I want to testify in favor. Basically, when I talk to colleagues of mine who are not in the supply chain space, I've got colleagues in AppSec and InfraSec who have been watching and following supply chain stuff, and I share stuff with them and they share stuff with me. But there are also a lot of folks in InfraSec and AppSec who do not follow this as part of their day job. And when I start talking to them about it, they're like, it's humongous. Where do I begin? How does it fit together? What's the big picture? We don't really have that. I have to sort of like try to break it down for them. Salsa focuses on this part, and S2C2 focuses on this part. I mean, I did a reading list for a blog article that's coming up recently, and I like sliced so much stuff. It's got like 90% of what we know just completely excluded because it's too overwhelming. And what I wish I had was something where I could be like, imagine you were a company that looked like this. Here is the mapping and the guidance of how it fits together and where you can start to learn. So that is my testimony.
Sure. Henrik.
Yeah, maybe I wanted to add a little bit on what Jonathan said earlier on. So when Pier Giorgio, myself, and the other co-authors of the paper developed this taxonomy, we really thought it would be a good idea to have this taxonomy take the form of an attack tree, right? This is why on the very left-hand side, you have the high-level goal of the attacker, and then the further you go down the tree, you have refinements, more specific techniques to reach the respective top-level goal. And so while we put a lot of effort into refining this attack tree, we put less effort until now, and I think this could be another future deliverable, into refining the safeguards to the same level of detail. And so right now we already have safeguards, and the way we have developed the tool, you could basically pick a certain safeguard and see which are the attack vectors partially or completely mitigated by the respective selected safeguard. And so one of the future deliverables I see would be going through all the OpenSSF solutions and projects and refine this safeguards part and map it to which are the addressed attack vectors.
Makes sense. Pier Giorgio.
Thank you. So first of all, really happy to be here. Thank you. What I wanted to say, I don't know if it goes really in the sense of the deliverable topic, but I just wanted to share a bit the goal that we had at the beginning of this taxonomy. So first of all, we started by categorizing and reviewing the literature, great literature, scientific literature to create this taxonomy. But I mean, one of the main goal of having this taxonomy is a bit like in the direction of the MITRE ATT&CK framework, like to explain and classify and detail the possible techniques to conduct supply chain attacks, how the current history explained to us how to conduct these attacks. So yeah, just wanted to share a bit the goal that was behind that, and I think this should be a community effort to maintain this knowledge base that could help in better reason about detection techniques, countermeasures, but also to spread awareness among the maintainers.
Justin.
Yeah, I think this is a great effort. I've been chatting with others about this, but there are a lot of other very closely related efforts in the CNCF and elsewhere. And so I wonder if also a lot of outreach is needed to be done to pull this together, because it feels like we're otherwise going to have a pretty disjoint collection of things that are probably also going to be fairly opinionated, which is something that we want to avoid, is that, you know, group X thinks their technology is awesome, and so group X solves all problems, sort of thing. So I wonder what the thoughts are about how to handle those types of issues.
Justin, you just made my point that I was writing in chat as well.
Not sure who was first, whether it was Krove or Jock. So Krove, you're first on my list, so go ahead.
I yield the first part of my hand to Jonathan, who physically has his hand up.
I cannot take, from a technical perspective, do that other than manually. So thank you. Yeah, I guess to address some of those points, I guess you know, what success looks like on this is, you know, we've checked with a couple of end users and industries already, or quite a lot actually, and it really does provide that, look, this is where the threats are coming from. This is what you need to be concerned about. And this is where you can start to look at for a solution going forwards, whether that's within this group, within CNCF, but at the very least provides the ability to talk about what you need to be aware of at the first part, the threats that are coming in and how to discuss them. And then I think to Justin's point, that there are multiple different groups within this and within CNCF where we can look at. Right now, we've got an architecture, a threat model, and the taxonomy, and discuss it. It might not be a single solution of how to mitigate it, but at least you can talk about where to look. So it would be at least that sort of roadmap of where people could navigate the space. And I think, if I may, just one last point is maintenance on this, in that we're looking at additional sources in the industry about where we're seeing attacks come through. We can continue to maintain and look at those threats and see how new threats are evolving and how that would pertain to that threat model and to those architectures, so that we can see, look, we now have a gap, or actually is something we can solve. Thanks, Grub, for yielding. Yield back.
You're welcome. My first point, full disclosure, I am a participant in the end user working group, and I've been a sounding board for Jonathan on some of these materials. So I am biased. But I would ask Jonathan directly, while we have the TAC here, specifically, what are you asking the TAC for? We allow our working groups a high degree of flexibility to kind of manage their own projects. So specifically, what would you like from the TAC around these artifacts and the group in general?
So I think very specifically on the taxonomy agreement, that it would be appropriate to adopt that taxonomy specifically within the end user group, and we can look to host the website within the OSSF. That's number one. Secondly, approval that we can start an initiative, and I'd like to get some guidance on how we would initiate that initiative to pull together the architecture, do the threat models appropriately, and then work to align the different solutions to that. So there are outcomes that we would be working on specifically around the architecture's threat models, and then mapping it to those outcomes. So it is to create an initiative.
Ava, go ahead.
Jonathan, thank you. I think those are really well-defined points for the TAC to think about. I think the TAC needs time to check in with our member companies, our constituent groups, before we could vote on something like that, because it would be, sounds like it would be quite a significant amount of work, and potentially changing what a lot of other things have already been produced. And I, for example, would want to go verify that this taxonomy is at a minimum compatible with all of my member companies and my board members' products in this space. We don't want to create conflict for members by naming things in ways that are incompatible. And so there's a lot to do there to make this a sort of very official OpenSSF agreed lexicon.
Justin?
Okay, yeah, and I'd also say that especially how this interacts with other groups probably needs to be clarified. That was one point I was like hoping to hear more about, because there's an awful lot that's gone many steps in this direction by different other groups, and that the part of that I was hoping to hear a little more said about how that interaction would go.
John, do you have thoughts or response there?
Yeah, so part of what we're trying to do in the end user group is that outreach. It's part of our charter to outreach to other groups. We've actually got members from end user group within the other working groups contributing directly into them, and also within the CNCF. So it is written into the charter to do that outreach and to ensure that we provide bi-directional feedback into this and the end user group in general. So the initial point would be to start out with the architecture of what consumers would look like, and again get any feedback from what that would look like, then threat model them, and then work with the TAC and other working groups to figure out, right, given that architecture, given that threat model, what solutions are available? Does anyone know? And let's go and outreach and talk to those individuals, whether it's the CNCF, the TAG security piece, the working supply chain group within the TAG that I kicked off some time ago, or the integrity group we have here, or indeed the Diagram Society. So it is actually part of our charter, but I think we need to build the architecture first to show what we're trying to protect, or at the same time. But build out the architecture and understand what we're trying to protect, and then go after those parts as well. Those are my thoughts on it, Justin, but I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I worry a little bit about like scoping and building that architecture and stuff without having that interaction in some ways, because I think in a lot of the threat modeling and other efforts, there's a tendency for people to only see part of the elephant. I'm not saying that I'm immune to that either, but I think there's lots and lots of real world examples about things coming out apparently from left field that have happened to major companies that are often missed in a lot of these analyses.
Yeah, great point, right? And with those architectures, we're building it with some of those companies, and example companies, so that they are the elephant, right? And it's trying to pull out, what would go into those architectures by literally talking to those individuals themselves, right? And with your expertise from a threat modeling standpoint, that'd be invaluable as well, work with others, but also they would be the actual consumers.
So I'll go next, and I'll go back to maybe some of the early comments in the chat with this question, John. I think we have a number of governing board members and observers on the line here at the moment, and kind of circling back to the topic of the last TAC meeting, which was a summary of the meeting we had in Tahoe, going back even further than that. The rallying cry for, at the time the term being used was Sterling toolchain, but I guess what I want to do is maybe open it up for a sense of consensus or comments around, do we feel like that essentially what's being described here in kind of your sequential plan of taxonomy, let's align both internally within the OpenSSF as well as externally with the groups that Justin, I think, was mentioning, as well as yourself, to those end artifacts that you described? Is that, in essence, does that deliver on that ask from the governing board, in your opinion? Are there gaps from others? Because I think that's a really critical conclusion that if we can come to and seem to get consensus around, I think that's a very powerful message. But I don't want to presume that if folks don't naturally have that alignment or have concerns or questions there. So
if I may reply to that, right? So I see this as connecting to that directly, right? This provides the requirements of what we're trying to fix and shows what people are trying to protect. So that we can talk about it and then discuss and figure out what tool chain we need to put in place to mitigate those threats. And until we build out that architecture and threat model, we don't necessarily understand what we're actually trying to build within the tool chain. By doing this, we understand those security requirements up front, or at least have a way of talking about it and starting to map that out, so that then we can figure out, right, given that, end user or entity and what they're trying to do to protect their supply chain, given how we can talk about it through that taxonomy, now we can figure out what we need to build within a supply chain, perhaps to Sterling tool chain, to mitigate those threats and provide that capability. So it's kind of I see it as the front end piece to that Sterling tool chain.
Yeah, just to throw it out, John, you and I have talked about this. So I also share that opinion as well. I think that this is maybe a stone that maybe not the most correct way to frame it, but we get a lot of leverage out of this sort of investment, both in terms of where we are as a foundation, as well as where we want to go. But again, I think this is a point that is important, that if folks don't understand it now or in the near term, it is something that I would like to get clarity on, because if this is going to serve that purpose as kind of driving a rallying cry, consistency in how we talk about represent the foundation, this is something that TAC needs to be supportive of. So say if folks have comments now, that'd be great. If not, then I would ask folks to also take an action item to look more deeply at the documents that John and the working group has shared here. In terms of next steps, I don't see any hands going up. So in terms of next steps on this, I think I would agree with Ava. I think time boxing this to the next TAC meeting as an agenda item to say, hey, we've had 2 weeks to go look at this. Checkpoint around, do folks understand kind of the sequence and activity here, and using that as also a forum to do some communication out to other working group leads around, hey, this is what's being discussed. It obviously impacts the supply chain integrity group, the best practices group, many of the activities that we have going on. So I want to make sure that we handle the comms on this to the broader community in an appropriate way here as well. So does that sound amenable as the next step? Let's come back in 2 weeks and discuss, do we have consensus, and then a stab at comms. Okay, great. I see Ava has added a comment here. How would we ensure that this is getting the appropriate review by constituent groups, not just merely 1 or 2 members who overlap with those groups? Again, I think this is where, again, using the communication vehicles that we have around mailing lists and meetings, and making sure that we are amplifying this work as much as possible, and being inclusive around opinions. But like all things in open source, those who show up with code or the pen ultimately get to shape things. So I think this is making sure that we are doing a correct call for participation here is certainly important. But also we do want to make progress, and that is kind of a theme that did come out of the governing board meetings late last year. Was we have a lot of good organic activity going on, but we need to evolve that and accelerate that in many different ways. So I do think, in my opinion, the answer to that question, Ava, is really around communications and CFPs, and making sure folks are aware that this activity is happening. I see a couple of hands did go up off that. So
yeah, I think it was Henrik, me, and then Justin.
Yeah, maybe coming back to getting the community's feedback on the completeness and correctness of the taxonomy, it's worthwhile to mention that we ran some questionnaires where we had like 15 people, and I believe a couple of a few of you may have been participating in this questionnaire back then, where we wanted to have, and collected your feedback on, is it properly structured? What are the names? Is everything covered that you can imagine? And a good number of the feedback was also reflected. So what you see here already got through a round of experts in the field of software supply chain security.
And Henrik, I appreciate that clarity. I in no way mean to disparage the work or imply that it didn't have tremendous expert input. What I'm pointing at here, and I hate to be the one proposing bureaucracy again, or perceived as such, but is the import and the impact of the OpenSSF blessing this taxonomy publicly. If we want that to have the sort of catalytic impact that it could have across the industry in open source, then a consensus building process where we reach out to the CNCF tag security, we reach out to other groups, we bring them to our table, and we work through that process with them to get consensus. That process that builds their buy-in on this is important, and far more important than us just planting a flag and saying, here's what we have said, take it or leave it. Because if we do that, my concern is other groups will say, well, we've put 2 years of work into our thing, we're not going to change. I would rather, I think all of us agree, we've talked about this at length, that we build a set of tools and terminologies that can be used whole cloth across as much of open source, if not all of it, as possible. So I would rather, I think this is a really important thing to work on. It's important enough that actually I began doing this myself years ago and then dropped the ball on it. But it's the kind of thing that I don't think we can rush in the next 2 weeks and have the TAC give a thumbs up and say, yes, we believe this taxonomy as written is the one we should adopt. I think this is worth starting up a process that might take longer than 2 weeks. I don't know how long it'll take, but I'd love to see the CNCF tag security, maybe even relevant groups at other bodies outside the LF, come to the table, debate it with us, and go away with agreement. And then we put it up on our website and plant our banner on it.
Since
I couldn't agree more with what Ava said. And a lot of what I'm was gonna say would be duplicative. So I will also say that I had a round of feedback, and I think others probably have also. And I think there are definitely things that are not perfect or could be improved in what is currently there. And I don't mean this as a like, you know, hey, look, there's some part of the elephant you didn't see, therefore the whole effort is flawed way. I just mean that I would be strongly encouraged not to approve something formally in a short time period and to go through a longer process.
Yeah, to be fair, like if folks heard me saying we should rush to approve in 2 weeks, that's not what I was proposing. It was more, let's take the time to go read the document, form our own opinions, and bring those opinions back at the next meeting. If we do find that folks say directionally accurate, it's worth trying to work on a communication strategy to bring the right folks at the table and ultimately evolve this, that's great. But I think I'm not proposing that we necessarily try to rush anything through and claim it to be the formal opinion. But I do think we have to be biased to action on taking the time to actually review it, coming back with feedback, and saying that we can't endlessly stay in a review cycle stage for another 12 months on this. We do need to make forward progress. So I think we're trying to strike an appropriate balance of inclusion, making sure that we do have the right folks at the table, but ultimately recognize that this will be an iterative process going forward. And so let's make an internal judgment on, is this directionally accurate, and try to iterate and make it better over time, I think is the goal that I'm trying to strike.
Sorry, and can I interject like a really quick suggestion, which is that there's a rather massive catalog of supply chain compromises that was referenced that the CNCF has. And seeing where everything maps into the taxonomy, because there are incidents, for instance, where Apple and Microsoft have accidentally pushed out releases that were valid software they were trying to do, but were only beta releases and were accidentally pushed. That's one example of something that I don't think is captured by the taxonomy. And I think doing an exercise like that will cause lots of other things like that to surface, where you'll see that that some part of the elephant is in the shadow right now, and we need to draw it out in the light.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's totally fair. I think we 6 months from now or 9 months from now, we'll probably find other things that probably aren't covered. So I think it's a matter of making sure we have a process to iterate, but making sure that we're starting from a kernel of the things that the TAC has looked at and generally says, hey, this is a good starting point to jump off from. And it seems as if, from my perspective, we have the end user working group here standing up and saying, hey, we have the the engagement and the willingness to help shepherd this, which is, I think, again, a critical part to this as well. So I think the TAC owes that working group its time and attention on coming to that assessment, at least in the short term, on, again, directional accuracy. John may have better, more eloquent ways to put that, but that's what I would come back to. So with recognizing we are at time for today's meeting, I guess, John, any closing comments on this before we end today's call?
No, really, other than thank you very much for your time. It's something that we, we believe in passionately, and I think there's great feedback from the TAC on that. I think it's completely reasonable to review it in detail. I would just add that I did go through there's some data set from In-Q-Tel with supply chain attacks, and I did look at mapping that directly to taxonomy, and it was reasonable. But absolutely, it needs to be validated by other people and incrementally reviewed. So I think I'd welcome that, to echo previous comments from Justin and Ava. So thank you for your time and continued effort on this.
No, thanks for bringing.
Thank you.